Morgan Freeman walked into an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, dressed in simple attire, an old coat and his signature fedora. But before he could even place an order, a waitress approached him with a contemptuous look and an arrogant posture. She glanced at him and sneered, "This isn't a budget diner, you know." And what happened next didn't just silence the entire restaurant. It revealed a truth that left everyone in shock. The Sapphire stood tall among Manhattan's most prestigious dining establishments, its blue-tinted glass facade reflecting the evening, city lights like precious gems. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and silver cutlery that gleamed under the tasteful lighting. The gentle hum of conversation mixed with the soft notes of a grand piano in the corner, a carefully orchestrated symphony of luxury and exclusivity. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution, a place where celebrities, business, magnates and the city's elite came to see and be seen. The Sapphire had earned its Michelin stars through exquisite cuisine and flawless service, but something more profound lay beneath its success, a vision that remained invisible to most of its staff. Julian Mercer straightened his crisp black uniform and adjusted his bow tie, surveying the dining room with calculating eyes. At 28, he was the newest addition to the Sapphire's waitstaff, handpicked from a five-star hotel in Los Angeles. His resume was impeccable, his knowledge of fine wines impressive, but beneath his polished exterior beat the heart of a social climber who measured human worth by the price tag of one's watch. "Table 7 needs their check," Diana Reynolds, the restaurant manager, said as she passed by. Her elegant posture and confident stride reflected her 15 years of experience in the hospitality industry. "And Julian, remember what I told you about approaching new guests?" Julian nodded dismissively. In his 3 weeks at the Sapphire, he'd already developed a system for identifying worthy patrons, those who belonged here and those who didn't. Diana's reminders about treating all guests equally seemed quaint to him, unnecessary wisdom, for someone who understood the unwritten rules of high society. "I know how to spot the ones who matter," he muttered under his breath as Diana walked away. In the kitchen, head chef Marcus Wilson was in his element, commanding his team with precision and passion. "More delicate with the plating, Thomas. This isn't assembly line work." His voice carried authority earned through decades of culinary excellence. What none of them knew was that tonight, everything would change. Morgan Freeman stepped out of his modest sedan, handing the keys to the valet, who gave him a curious glance. After a long day visiting construction sites for his newest business venture, he hadn't bothered changing from his comfortable attire. Worn jeans, a simple button-up shirt, and his favorite old coat that had seen better days. The black fedora, a gift from an old friend, sat comfortably on his head. "Will you be dining with us tonight, sir?" the valet asked, uncertainty in his voice. Morgan nodded with a gentle smile. "Yes, I thought I'd check in on things." It had been 6 months since Morgan had last visited the Sapphire, the restaurant he'd quietly purchased 3 years ago. Usually his visits were announced, allowing for the customary preparation and deference due to an owner. But tonight, something had prompted him to arrive unannounced, a desire to experience his establishment as an ordinary guest would. "Sometimes you see the truth more clearly when no one knows who you are," he murmured to himself as he pushed through the elegant revolving door. The maitre d' was attending to a group of executives, allowing Morgan to slip into the waiting area, unnoticed. He took a moment to absorb the atmosphere, the pleasant buzz of conversation, the subtle aromas from the kitchen, the way the lighting caught the crystal glasses. This was exactly what he'd envisioned when he rescued the struggling restaurant years ago. Not just a place of luxury, but one of warmth and genuine hospitality. Julian noticed the newcomer immediately. His eyes narrowed as they took in the worn coat, the casual pants, the unpolished shoes. In Julian's mental ledger, this man belonged nowhere near the Sapphire's pristine interior. When the maitre d' remained occupied, Julian decided to handle the situation himself. He approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting the only help the man needed was directions to somewhere else. Morgan looked up, his warm eyes meeting Julian's cold gaze. "Yes, I'd like a table for one, please." Julian's smile tightened. "I'm afraid we're quite busy tonight. Do you have a reservation?" I don't, Morgan replied calmly. As I suspected, Julian said, barely containing his satisfaction. We're typically booked weeks in advance. Perhaps I could suggest somewhere more suitable for your immediate dining needs. An elderly couple seated nearby glanced over, frowning at Julian's tone. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded in disapproval. Morgan remained unperturbed. I was hoping you might have something available. Just one seat. I won't take up much space. Julian's posture became more rigid, his disdain more evident. This isn't just about space, sir. The Sapphire maintains certain standards. His eyes traveled deliberately from Morgan's fedora to his shoes. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere less formal. At a nearby table, Lisa Chen, a regular patron, looked up from her conversation, her attention caught by Julian's increasingly audible condescension. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the man in the fedora, but she remained silent, watching the scene unfold. Morgan simply smiled, showing no sign of offense. I understand your concern for your establishment's atmosphere. However, I'd still like to dine here tonight if possible. Julian's patience was wearing thin. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but ensuring it carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. Sir, I need to be clear. This isn't a budget diner. No. Our prefix begins at $150. The piano music seemed to fade as nearby conversations momentarily paused. Diana, who had been handling a wine selection across the room, turned her head sharply at Julian's words, but was too far away to intervene immediately. Morgan's expression remained composed, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement or perhaps something deeper. I'm well aware of the prices, he said, his distinctive voice carrying a natural authority that made Julian blink in momentary confusion. Before Julian could respond, Chef Marcus emerged from the kitchen to greet a regular customer and froze mid-stride when he spotted Morgan by the entrance. His face registered shock, then understanding, then a carefully controlled neutrality as he caught Morgan's subtle headshake. Julian, oblivious to this exchange, gathered himself and decided to take a different approach. Well then, he said, with exaggerated courtesy, perhaps we can accommodate you after all if you'll follow me. As Julian led Morgan not to the main dining area, but toward the least desirable table in the house, near the kitchen doors where the noise and traffic would disturb any meal, Diana finally managed to break away from her previous task. She approached quickly, her professional smile barely concealing her concern. Julian, she called, her voice pleasant but firm, is our guest being seated? Julian turned, a self-satisfied expression on his face. Yes, I've found the perfect spot. For him. Diana's eyes moved to Morgan, recognition flashing across her features before she masterfully composed herself. I see, she said carefully. And has our guest been offered a drink while he waits? I didn't think, Julian began. That's precisely the problem, Diana cut in softly, then turned to Morgan with genuine respect, carefully disguised as standard courtesy. Sir, please accept my apologies for the wait. May I offer you a complimentary glass of our house champagne while Julian prepares your table? Morgan nodded with a smile. That would be lovely, thank you. As Diana walked away to fetch the champagne, Julian resumed leading Morgan to the undesirable table, unaware that his every word and gesture were being carefully noted by the very man who owned the ground beneath his feet. The evening had only just begun, and already the stage was set for a lesson in dignity and respect that no one at the Sapphire would ever forget. Julian led Morgan to a small table tucked away in the corner near the kitchen's swinging doors. The constant movement of servers and the occasional clatter of dishes created a stark contrast to the serene atmosphere of the main dining area. This was where Julian seated guests he deemed unworthy of the Sapphire's ambiance, an unofficial punishment zone. Here we are, Julian announced with a thin smile, pulling out the chair with minimal effort. I think you'll find this is cozy. Morgan surveyed the table calmly, noting its wobbly leg and proximity to the kitchen traffic. With deliberate slowness, he removed his fedora, placed it on the empty chair across from him, and sat down. Thank you, he replied, his voice carrying that distinctive resonance that had narrated countless documentaries, and brought gravitas to dozens of films. Something in that voice made Julian pause momentarily, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, before his arrogance reasserted itself. "Our sommelier is occupied with our premium guests at the moment," Julian said, emphasizing the word premium while handing Morgan a wine list. "But I'd be happy to recommend something within reason." The slight emphasis wasn't lost on Morgan, who simply opened the leather-bound menu and began perusing it thoughtfully. At a nearby table, an elderly couple exchanged glances of disapproval. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him shake his head in dismay. Morgan's thoughts drifted briefly to why he had purchased the sapphire 3 years ago. It hadn't been a mere business investment. Having grown up with little, he understood how it felt to be judged by appearance rather than character. When the opportunity arose to acquire this struggling but once legendary restaurant, his vision had been clear. Create an establishment where exceptional food was matched by exceptional humanity. Julian hovered impatiently. "Perhaps I could suggest our house wine? It's quite accessible." The implication was clear. Julian assumed Morgan couldn't afford the finer selections. Morgan looked up, his eyes meeting Julian's with a gaze that had commanded respect on movie sets for decades. "Actually," Morgan said, his finger landing on one of the most expensive bottles on the list, "I'd like the 1982 Chateau Margaux." Julian's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, that's a $2,000 bottle." "I'm aware of its value," Morgan replied evenly. Julian's mouth formed a tight line. "Very well, I'll see if it's available, though I doubt it. That particular vintage is typically reserved for our established clientele." As Julian walked away, Diana approached with the promised glass of champagne. "Here you are, sir," she said, placing it carefully on the table. Her eyes conveyed silent apology. "Thank you, Diana," Morgan replied quietly. Diana's eyes widened slightly at the use of her name, which she hadn't provided. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and simply nodded before departing. From the kitchen doorway, Chef Marcus observed the interaction, his experienced eyes missing nothing. He'd worked with Morgan to revamp the Sapphires menu when the actor had first acquired the restaurant. Marcus recognized the situation unfolding. Morgan was experiencing the establishment incognito, and Julian was failing spectacularly at the most fundamental aspect of hospitality. Julian returned moments later, his expression smug. "I'm afraid that particular wine isn't available tonight. Perhaps something more appropriate?" "I see," Morgan said calmly. "What would you recommend?" Julian gestured dismissively toward the lower end of the menu. "These selections might better suit your—" He paused, eyes flicking to Morgan's simple attire. "Preferences." At a table across the room, Lisa Chen, a tech executive and regular patron, watched the interaction with increasing discomfort. She recognized Morgan Freeman immediately, but remained silent, following his lead in maintaining his anonymity. The waiter's condescension, however, was becoming difficult to witness. Morgan selected a still excellent but more moderately priced bottle. "This one, then." Julian nodded with poorly concealed satisfaction. "A more sensible choice," he remarked, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. "Now, as for our menu, the chef's tasting experience begins at $250 per person, but we do offer some à la carte options that might be more suitable for your visit." The elderly gentleman at the nearby table cleared his throat loudly, drawing Julian's attention. "Young man," he said firmly, "I believe your guest deserves the same respect you've shown to the rest of us this evening." Julian's face flushed. "Of course, sir, I'm simply helping him navigate our offerings." Turning back to Morgan, he added, "No offense intended." "None taken," Morgan replied with dignity, though his eyes reflected awareness of every slight. Julian hastily handed over the dinner menu. "I'll return shortly for your order," he said before retreating to the bar, where he exchanged whispers with another server, both glancing back at Morgan with barely disguised amusement. Morgan observed this, all while reflecting on the purpose of the sapphire. When he'd purchased it, he'd insisted on one core philosophy. Every guest deserves exceptional service, regardless of appearance or status. Clearly, that message had not reached Julian. The wine arrived, presented by a different server who handled the bottle with proper respect, and poured a taste for Morgan with professional courtesy. Morgan nodded his approval, noting how this server, unlike Julian, demonstrated proper training. When Julian returned, his demeanor had hardened into barely concealed disdain. "Have you decided what you'll be having this evening?" he asked, Penny, poised over notepad. "Yes," Morgan replied. "I'll start with the seared scallops, followed by the dry-aged ribeye, medium rare." Julian wrote this down with a slight smirk. "The ribeye is $95 alone," he said, the warning clear in his tone. "I'm comfortable with that," Morgan replied simply. Julian paused, then added with false solicitousness, "You do understand that we have a minimum gratuity of 20% for whole checks exceeding $200. I wouldn't want you to be surprised." The elderly woman nearby gasped audibly at this blatant insult. Lisa Chen set down her glass with more force than necessary. Even a couple at a distant table who couldn't hear the exchange sensed the tension from Julian's body language. Morgan, however, remained composed. He smiled, a smile that had charmed audiences worldwide, and said, "I appreciate your concern for my finances, but please don't let that worry you." Julian collected the menu with a stiff nod and walked away, mumbling something to another server. That caused them both to chuckle. As he pushed through the kitchen doors, Chef Marcus caught his arm. "Who's at table 15? Marcus asked quietly. "Nobody important," Julian replied dismissively. "Just some old man who wandered in off the street. Probably spent his whole month's pension on dinner." Marcus's expression darkened. "Every guest in this restaurant is important, Julian. That's the Sapphire's philosophy." Julian shrugged. "Some more than others. Trust me, I know how to spot the ones who matter." As Julian moved away, Marcus exchanged a glance with Diana, who had overheard the exchange. Their silent communication acknowledged the problem unfolding before them, and the reckoning that would inevitably follow when Julian discovered exactly who he'd been insulting all evening. Back at his table, Morgan sipped his wine thoughtfully, his legendary patience evident in every deliberate movement. The evening was young and the lesson had only just begun. The soft piano music wove through the Sapphire's elegant interior as conversations hummed at a respectable volume. At a table near the center of the restaurant, Lisa Chen set down her water glass and discreetly glanced toward the corner where Morgan Freeman sat alone. As the CEO of a successful tech company, Lisa had dined at the Sapphire numerous times, often bringing important clients to impress them with the restaurant's impeccable service and exquisite cuisine. "Is everything all right?" asked her dinner companion, noticing her distraction. Lisa turned back with a slight frown. "Not exactly. Do you see that gentleman in the corner, the one by the kitchen doors?" Her companion turned subtly. "The older man in the simple clothes. What about him?" "That's Morgan Freeman," she whispered, "and that waiter has been treating him horribly." Across the room, the elderly couple who had witnessed Julian's behavior continued to observe with growing displeasure. Harold Bennett, a retired judge, leaned toward his wife of 45 years. "Margaret, I've half a mind to say something to the manager. This is absolutely unacceptable." Margaret nodded, her pearl earrings catching the light. "I haven't seen service this discriminatory since the 1970s. And to think it's happening to Morgan Freeman of all people." At another table, a young couple celebrating their anniversary had also noticed the strange dynamic. The husband, Michael, a film student at NYU, immediately recognized the actor, but was confused by the staff's treatment of him. "That's bizarre," he whispered to his wife. "Why would they seat Morgan Freeman by the kitchen? And that waiter keeps treating him like he doesn't belong here." As these conversations quietly unfolded throughout the restaurant, Julian returned to Morgan's table, setting down the appetizer with noticeably less care than he'd shown to other patrons. "Your scallops," he announced flatly. "The kitchen was backed up with orders from our regular guests, so I apologize for any delay." Morgan regarded the dish with appreciation. "They look excellent," he replied, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Several heads turned at the sound of that distinctive baritone. A businessman at the bar paused mid-conversation, his brow furrowing in recognition. Two women dining near the window exchanged glances and whispers. Julian, oblivious to the ripple of recognition moving through the restaurant, continued his thinly veiled condescension. Will you need anything else, or shall I leave you to enjoy your meal in peace? The implication that Morgan shouldn't bother him further hung in the air. Actually, Morgan said, I'd like to know more about the restaurant. How long have you worked here, Julian? Surprised at hearing his name, which he hadn't offered, Julian hesitated. 3 weeks, he finally answered. I came from La Maison in Los Angeles. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. And what would you say is the philosophy of the Sapphire? What makes it special? Julian straightened his posture, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge. The Sapphire caters to an exclusive clientele who appreciate the finer things in life. We maintain certain standards to ensure our regular patrons feel at home among their peers. Morgan's eyes revealed nothing as he absorbed this distortion of his restaurant's true mission. I see. And who owns the Sapphire? Someone local. Julian scoffed slightly. The owner is an investor who rarely visits. Most of these high-end places are just portfolio additions for wealthy businessmen who leave the actual running to professionals like Diana and myself. From her position near the host stand, Diana overheard this exchange and visibly winced. Chef. Marcus, who had emerged briefly to check on a VIP table, caught her eye and raised an eyebrow in silent communication. Meanwhile, Lisa Chen had made a decision. Rising gracefully from her table, she navigated through the dining room toward Morgan's corner. Mr. Freeman, she said warmly as she approached, I hope I'm not interrupting your meal, but I just wanted to say how much I admired your work in Shawshank Redemption. It's still one of my favorite films. Julian froze, his expression shifting from dismissive to confused in an instant. He looked between Lisa, whom he recognized as a valued regular, and Morgan, struggling to process this development. Morgan smiled genuinely at Lisa. That's very kind of you. It's always nice to meet a fan. Lisa extended her hand. Lisa Chen. I'm here quite often for business dinners. The Sapphire has always been one of my favorite restaurants in the city. Julian hovered awkwardly, his previous certainty crumbling as he watched one of the Sapphire's most valued patrons treating his unimportant guest with reverence. Mr. Freeman, Lisa continued, pointedly ignoring Julian, I have to ask, what brings you to the Sapphire tonight? I've never seen you here before. Morgan's eyes twinkled with amusement. Let's just say I have a vested interest in the establishment. More heads were turning now. The elderly couple, the film student and his wife, the businessman at the bar, all watching this interaction with growing interest. Julian's treatment of Morgan had not gone unnoticed, and the contrast between that treatment and Lisa's respectful approach was striking. Well, Lisa said, I hope your experience tonight has been illuminating. Indeed it has, Morgan replied meaningfully. Julian cleared his throat. Ms. Chen, can I get you anything? Perhaps escort you back to your table. The subtle attempt to separate Lisa from Morgan didn't go unnoticed. Lisa smiled coolly at Julian. No, thank you, I'm perfectly fine where I am. Julian retreated a few steps, visibly uncomfortable. Morgan gestured to the empty chair across from him. Would you care to join me for a moment, Miss Chen? I'd be honored, she replied, taking the seat while Julian watched in growing dismay. Across the restaurant, Margaret Bennett nudged her husband. Look at that waiter's face. He's finally realizing he might have made a terrible mistake. Harold nodded. Too little, too late, I'd say. The damage is done. By now, whispers were circulating throughout the Sapphire. That's Morgan Freeman in the corner. Why is he seated by the kitchen? Did you see how that waiter was treating him? The restaurant's atmosphere had subtly shifted, a current of tension running beneath the elegant veneer. Chef Marcus approached Diana at the host stand. This is getting out of hand, he murmured. Julian has no idea who he's been disrespecting all night, does he? Diana shook her head slightly. No, and Mr. Freeman seems to be in no hurry to enlighten him. Should we intervene? Marcus asked. Diana watched as Morgan conversed warmly with Lisa Chen, while Julian hovered nearby, clearly reassessing his earlier judgment. I think Mr. Freeman has a plan, she replied quietly. Let's see how it unfolds. Back at the corner table, Lisa was saying, I've always appreciated how this restaurant treats all its guests with equal respect. It's one of the reasons I keep coming back. Morgan nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Julian's. That was certainly the intention when the sapphire was established. Julian's discomfort was now palpable. He approached the table again, his demeanor noticeably more deferential. "Mr. Freeman, is your appetizer to your liking? Can I bring you anything else?" The transformation in Julian's attitude wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Morgan, who simply smiled and said, "The scallops are excellent. My compliments to Chef Marcus." The mention of the chef by name further unsettled Julian, who was beginning to suspect there was much more to this unassuming man than he had initially assumed. As Lisa excused herself to return to her own table, the elderly Judge Bennett rose from his seat and made his way over. Julian watched with mounting anxiety as another valued guest approached the man he had dismissed and insulted throughout the evening. The reckoning was drawing nearer, and Julian was only just beginning to sense the depth of his misjudgment. The elegant dance of fine dining continued around Morgan Freeman's corner table, but a current of electricity now ran beneath the sapphire's polished surface. Judge Harold Bennett approached with the measured pace of a man who had spent decades commanding courtroom respect. "Mr. Freeman," he said, extending his hand. "Harold Bennett, I hope I'm not intruding." Morgan rose slightly from his seat, shaking the older man's hand with genuine warmth. "Not at all, Judge Bennett. Please, join me if you'd like." Julian, who had been hovering nearby, felt his stomach tighten at the realization that Morgan knew the judge's profession without being told. Something was very wrong with his initial assessment, and the ground beneath his confident demeanor was growing increasingly unstable. "I must say," Judge Bennett continued, settling into the chair Lisa Chen had vacated, "I've been observing the service this evening, and I find it rather inconsistent." Morgan's eyes crinkled with subtle amusement. "How so, Judge?" "Some guests seem to receive significantly more attention and respect than others," the judge replied, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward Julian. "In my courtroom, I always emphasize that true justice must be applied equally to all, regardless of appearance or station." Julian shifted uncomfortably, pretending to arrange nearby place settings while straining to hear their conversation. "Wise philosophy," Morgan agreed, taking a sip of his wine. "One that applies well beyond the courtroom." The judge nodded, then lowered his voice slightly. "My wife and I recognized you immediately, of course. We've been admirers of your work for decades, but I'm curious, why allow such treatment to continue? A word from you would set things right." Morgan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, Judge Bennett, the most valuable lessons come from allowing situations to unfold naturally. People reveal their true character when they believe no one of consequence is watching." Before the judge could respond, the restaurant's front doors opened, drawing all eyes momentarily to the entrance. A distinguished man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stepped inside. James Parker, Morgan's business partner and co-owner of the Sapphire, scanned the room with practiced ease. His eyes found Morgan in the corner, and a flash of surprise crossed his features before settling into understanding. Diana hurried to greet him. "Mr. Parker, welcome. We weren't expecting you this evening." "Last-minute decision," James replied, smoothly. "I'm meeting Morgan Freeman. I believe he's already here." Julian, who had been within earshot, froze at these words. His eyes darted between James Parker, whom he recognized as one of the restaurant's owners, and the man he'd been disrespecting all evening. A cold realization began to dawn on him, but his mind resisted the connection, still unable to believe. He could have made such a catastrophic error in judgment. Diana nodded. "Yes, Mr. Freeman is here. He's been dining with us for about an hour now." James smiled. "Excellent. No need to escort me. I see him." As James made his way through the restaurant, conversations quieted. The regular patrons recognized him immediately. Unlike Morgan, James was a frequent and visible presence at the Sapphire. Julian watched in mounting horror as James approached Morgan's table with the familiarity of a close friend. "Morgan," James called warmly, extending his hand. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible coming from Midtown." Morgan stood, embracing James with a smile. "James, good to see you. No problem at all. I've been enjoying the atmosphere and getting to know some of your regular customers." Judge Bennett rose as well, shaking James's hand. Mr. Parker, always a pleasure. Judge Bennett, James acknowledged. I see you've been keeping Morgan company. Julian hovered at the edge of this exchange, his mind racing to process the implications. If James Parker knew Morgan Freeman well, enough to meet him for dinner, and if Judge Bennett and Lisa Chen both recognized and respected him, then who exactly had Julian been dismissing and insulting all evening? Gathering his courage, Julian approached the table. Mr. Parker, welcome to the Sapphire. Can I get you something to drink? James turned, his expression pleasant but evaluating. Julian, isn't it? I'll have what Morgan's having. The casual use of first names between James and Morgan sent another jolt of anxiety through Julian's system. He nodded stiffly and retreated to the bar, where he whispered urgently to the bartender, "That's Morgan Freeman sitting with Mr. Parker." "The actual Morgan Freeman?" The bartender raised an eyebrow. "You're just realizing this now? Half the restaurant recognized him an hour ago." Julian's face flushed. Why didn't anyone say anything? Maybe because they were too busy watching you. "Treat him like he didn't belong here," the bartender replied pointedly. Back at the table, James was settling in across from Morgan as Judge Bennett excused himself to return to his wife. The two business partners surveyed the restaurant thoughtfully. "So," James said quietly, conducting a little unannounced quality. "Control." Morgan's eyes twinkled. "Something like that. I was curious to see the Sapphire through the eyes of an ordinary customer." "And," James prompted, "let's just say the experience has been educational," Morgan replied, his rich voice carrying a hint of irony. James glanced toward Julian, who was now frantically conferring with Diana near the host stand. "I gather our newest staff member hasn't been embodying the Sapphire's philosophy?" "He certainly has a unique interpretation of it," Morgan observed dryly. Diana approached their table, her professional composure masking her internal distress. "Mr. Freeman, Mr. Parker, is everything to your satisfaction?" Morgan smiled reassuringly. "Everything is revealing itself exactly as it should, Diana. No need to intervene." Diana understood the subtle message. Morgan was allowing the situation to play out deliberately. She nodded and withdrew, pulling Julian aside as she retreated. "Do you understand who that is?" she whispered urgently. Julian swallowed hard. "Morgan Freeman, the actor. I didn't recognize him at first." Diana's expression hardened. "He's not just Morgan Freeman, the actor. He's Morgan Freeman, the majority owner of the Sapphire, your employer." The color drained from Julian's face so rapidly that a nearby server stepped forward, concerned he might faint. That's impossible," he stammered. "The owner is a businessman who never visits. That's what I heard." "Whoever told you?" "That was misinformed," Diana replied coldly. "Morgan Freeman purchased the Sapphire 3 years ago. James Parker is his business partner, and you've spent the entire evening treating him like he doesn't deserve to be here." Julian looked stricken. "What do I do?" "For now, you do your job properly," Diana instructed. "Serve them with the respect you should have shown from the beginning. Mr. Freeman clearly has his reasons for not revealing himself yet." As Julian gathered his composure and approached the table with James's wine, conversations throughout the restaurant had taken on a new energy. Everyone was watching the drama unfold, anticipating the moment when Julian would fully realize the magnitude of his misjudgment. Morgan and James conversed quietly, occasionally glancing around the restaurant, with the measured assessment of owners taking stock of their investment. When Julian set down James's wine with newly found deference, Morgan looked up with that same patient smile that had remained unchanged throughout the evening's indignities. "Julian," Morgan said, his voice carrying that distinctive resonance that had narrated countless journeys through the cosmos, "I'd like to ask you something about the Sapphire." Julian stood rigidly at attention, aware that every eye in the restaurant was now upon him. "Yes, sir?" "In your own words," Morgan continued calmly, "who would you say is the ideal customer for this establishment?" The question hung in the air, like a judge's gavel poised to fall, and Julian realized with terrible clarity that his answer might well determine his future. Julian stood frozen before Morgan Freeman and James Parker, the question hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. The restaurant had grown unnaturally quiet, the pianist's fingers hovering above the keys, Conversations paused mid-sentence as all attention focused on their corner. "The ideal customer," Julian began, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, "is someone who appreciates fine dining," and he faltered as Morgan's steady gaze seemed to penetrate his rehearsed response. "Someone who can afford it," Morgan prompted, his tone gentle yet probing. Julian swallowed hard. "Well, yes, of course, but also someone dressed appropriately," James added, swirling his wine with casual precision. "I mean, we do have certain standards of—" "And who determines those standards, Julian?" Morgan asked, leaning forward slightly. "Who decides who belongs here and who doesn't?" Before Julian could formulate a response, Margaret Bennett rose from her table and approached with the quiet dignity of a woman who had witnessed decades of social change. Her husband, the judge, followed a step behind. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Morgan directly while pointedly ignoring Julian. "My husband and I couldn't help overhearing. If I may add something to this conversation." Morgan gestured welcomingly. "Please do, Mrs. Bennett." Julian's eyes widened at Morgan's knowledge of her name, another reminder of how completely he had misjudged the situation. "When we first started dining here years ago," Margaret continued, "the Sapphire was known for exceptional food, yes, but also for making every guest feel valued. It didn't matter if you were celebrating a once-in-a-lifetime occasion or were a regular patron, everyone received the same gracious welcome." Judge Bennett nodded in agreement. "However, in recent months we've noticed a shift, a certain selectiveness in how guests are treated." His gaze settled on Julian. "A hierarchy that never existed before." From across the room, Lisa Chen had been observing the unfolding scene. Now she too rose and joined the growing circle at Morgan's table. "As someone who brings business clients here regularly," she added, "I can confirm what the Bennetts are saying. The Sapphire's reputation was built on exceptional service for all guests, regardless of appearance or status. That's why I've recommended it to countless colleagues." Morgan absorbed these comments with thoughtful attention, his fingers steepled before him. "Interesting observations," he said finally. "It seems the Sapphire's original vision may have become somewhat diluted." Head chef Marcus, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, could remain silent no longer. Wiping his hands on his apron, he approached the table. "Mr. Freeman," he said with the quiet confidence of a man who took immense pride in his craft, "when you brought me on 3 years ago, you told me something I've never forgotten. You said, 'A great restaurant feeds the soul as much as the body, and every soul deserves that nourishment.'" Julian's face paled further at this unmistakable confirmation of Morgan's ownership. Marcus continued, "That philosophy guided every dish I created, knowing it would be served to every guest who walked through those doors, not just the ones in expensive suits." Diana joined them now, the manager's professional reserve momentarily abandoned. "Mr. Freeman, I want to apologize for tonight's service. This is not what the Sapphire stands for." Morgan raised a hand gently. "No apologies necessary, Diana. Sometimes we need to see the problem clearly before we can address it properly." The young film student Michael, who had been watching wide-eyed with his wife, suddenly spoke up from nearby. "Mr. Freeman, sir, your character in The Shawshank Redemption said that hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things. Is that why you're sitting through this dinner instead of revealing yourself right away? Because you hope the Sapphire can be better?" A murmur of appreciation rippled through the gathering crowd at the young man's insight. Morgan smiled warmly at Michael. "Hope is indeed powerful, but so is truth. And sometimes people need to see the truth about themselves, how their actions appear to others, before real change can happen." All eyes shifted to Julian, who stood mortified at the center of what had become an impromptu tribunal. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of someone watching their career implode in real time. Julian began, then stopped, unable to find adequate words. Morgan regarded him thoughtfully. "You know, Julian, I grew up poor in Mississippi. There were restaurants I couldn't enter because of the color of my skin. Later, even as I found success, there were places where staff would evaluate my worth, based on what I was wearing rather than who I was." He gestured around the Sapphire. That's why when I had the opportunity to create my own establishment, I was very specific about its values. James Parker nodded in agreement. The Sapphire was never meant to be exclusionary. Exceptional, yes. Exclusive, no. There's a critical difference. The elderly Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. In my years on the bench, I discovered that character reveals itself most truthfully when people believe no one important is watching. How we treat those we perceive as having no power over us, that's the measure of who we really are. Julian's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his actions settled upon him. Morgan had experienced every slight, every condescending remark, every deliberate attempt to make him feel unwelcome in his own restaurant. "Mr. Freeman," Julian finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to say." "Perhaps," Morgan suggested gently, "you might start by reconsidering your answer to my original question. Who is the ideal customer for the Sapphire?" Julian looked around at the gathered faces, Morgan Freeman and James Parker, the Bennetts, Lisa Chen, Chef Marcus Diana, and the young film student with his wife. In each expression he saw not judgment but expectation, a collective hope that he might recognize his error and grow from it. "The ideal customer," he began again, more thoughtfully this time, "is anyone who values good food and respectful service. Anyone who walks through that door deserving to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they're wearing or how much money they appear to have." He paused, then added with genuine realization, "The ideal customer is everyone." Morgan nodded, slowly satisfaction evident in his eyes. "That's a good start, Julian." James Parker glanced at his watch. "Morgan, we still have those expansion plans to discuss. Should we move to your usual table?" A ripple of surprise went through those who hadn't yet fully grasped Morgan's position. His usual table, further confirmation that the modest man in the fedora was indeed a regular presence here, unseen by those who judged solely by appearance. Morgan considered the suggestion, then shook his head. "No, I think I'll stay right here. This table has provided quite an education tonight for all of us." As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, returning to their respective tables, Julian remained standing uncertainly beside Morgan. "Julian," Morgan said quietly, "I believe I'm ready for my main course now, and perhaps you might bring menus for Mr. Parker and myself. We have business to discuss." It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was an opportunity, a chance for redemption that Julian had done nothing to deserve but was being offered nonetheless. As he hurried toward the kitchen, Julian felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant following him. The lesson was still unfolding, and he was its reluctant student. The Sapphire had transformed over the past hour. What had begun as an ordinary evening of fine dining had evolved into something altogether different, a masterclass in humility playing out amid crystal glasses and white linen. Julian delivered Morgan's ribeye with newfound care, his hands steady despite his internal turmoil. The steak was perfectly cooked, presented with the elegant simplicity that was Chef Marcus's signature. As Julian set the plate down, he noticed a small detail. The dish had been garnished with a sprig of rosemary, arranged in a way he'd never seen before. "Chef Marcus prepared this specially," Diana said, appearing at Julian's side. "It's Mr. Freeman's preferred presentation, though it's not on our regular menu." This small revelation struck Julian profoundly. Not only was Morgan Freeman the owner, but the chef prepared personalized dishes for him, dishes that Julian, in his assumed expertise, hadn't even known existed. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Julian asked, his previous condescension replaced. With genuine attentiveness, Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Julian, I'd like to hear more about your understanding of the Sapphire. You mentioned earlier that the owner is an investor who rarely visits." Julian's cheeks flushed. I was mistaken. Sir, clearly. Where did you get that impression?" James Parker asked, his tone conversational yet probing. Julian shifted uncomfortably. "During my interview, I asked about the ownership, and someone mentioned an investment group. You assumed the owner would be a certain type." "Of person," Morgan finished for him. "Perhaps someone who looks more like James here." The observation was gentle but direct. Julian had indeed pictured the owner as someone like James Parker, polished, conventionally successful, dressed in expensive attire that announced his status to the world. Yes, sir, Julian admitted quietly. Morgan cut into his steak, savoring a bite before continuing. When I first considered purchasing this restaurant, it was struggling, not for lack of culinary talent, but because it had lost its sense of purpose. James nodded in agreement. The previous owners treated it purely as a status symbol. They were more concerned with who was dining here than how they were being served. Which is precisely why I was drawn to it, Morgan continued. I saw an opportunity to create something different, a place where exceptional food and service were available to anyone who walked through those doors, regardless of appearance or background. Julian listened, absorbing the philosophy he had. So fundamentally misunderstood and misrepresented. Morgan gestured around the dining room. I designed the Sapphire's mission statement myself, to provide an experience of dignity where the art of fine dining becomes accessible without pretension. Does that align with how you've been approaching your role, Julian? The question hung in the air, impossible to evade. No, sir, Julian answered honestly. I've been doing exactly the opposite. At nearby tables, conversations had resumed, but with a different quality, more thoughtful, more aware. The evening's events had affected not just Julian, but everyone who had witnessed them. Diana approached with a bottle of wine. Mr. Freeman, Mr. Parker, would you like to try the new Barolo we've been considering for the list? Morgan smiled warmly. Excellent suggestion, Diana, and please join us for a moment. Diana seemed unsurprised by the invitation, pulling up a chair with the ease of someone who had done so before. This too was revealing, the familiar rapport between owner and manager speaking to a relationship built on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. Diana, Morgan said as she poured the wine, how would you describe the Sapphire's philosophy to new staff members? Diana considered the question carefully. I tell them that we're in the business of creating memories, not just meals, that every guest deserves to feel valued, whether they're celebrating a special occasion or simply treating themselves to a weeknight dinner. She glanced at Julian, and that our job is never to judge who belongs here, but to ensure everyone feels that they do. Julian absorbed her words, recognizing how dramatically his own approach had diverged from this vision. 3 years ago, Morgan continued, swirling the wine in his glass, when I purchased this place, I made certain promises, that the Sapphire would never become exclusionary, that we would judge success not by the wealth of our clientele, but by the quality of their experience, that every person who walked through those doors would be treated with the same respect. James nodded. Morgan insisted on it, actually, made it a condition of our partnership agreement. Julian's eyes widened slightly at this information. Morgan Freeman hadn't just purchased the Sapphire as a vanity investment, he had specifically shaped its mission and values. I didn't know, Julian said softly. That was rather the point of tonight, Morgan replied, to see the Sapphire as an ordinary guest would experience it, to understand if we're living up to those promises. Julian understood the implication. In Morgan's experiment, he had failed spectacularly. Chef Marcus mentioned you hired him personally, Julian said, attempting to piece together the full picture. Morgan nodded. I did, along with Diana and most of the senior staff. We built this team carefully, selecting people who shared our vision for what the Sapphire could be. This revelation further dismantled Julian's assumptions. Far from being an absentee owner, Morgan had been intimately involved in creating the restaurant's identity. Diana smiled at a memory. Mr. Freeman spent weeks in the kitchen with Marcus, developing the original menu. He tasted every dish, suggested adjustments, even named several of our signature offerings. Julian thought back to his dismissive comments about the owner, how confidently he had spoken about someone he didn't know at all. The truth is, Morgan said, fixing Julian with that penetrating gaze, I care deeply about this place, not just as a business investment, but as an extension of personal values I've held throughout my life. Values about dignity, respect, and the fundamental worth of every human being. James added. Morgan has turned down multiple offers to sell, some quite lucrative, because he's committed to preserving the Sapphire's mission. Julian swallowed hard. The man he had dismissed so casually, seated at the worst table and treated with thinly veiled contempt, wasn't just a celebrity owner. He was the heart and soul of the Sapphire, the architect of its philosophy. "I've made a terrible mistake," Julian acknowledged. Morgan regarded him thoughtfully. "Knowledge is the beginning of change, Julian. Now you understand what the sapphire truly stands for. The question is, what will you do with that understanding?" Before Julian could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A group of well-dressed executives had arrived, loud and slightly intoxicated, demanding immediate seating without reservations. Diana excused herself to handle the situation. "Perhaps," Morgan suggested, setting down his fork, "this is an opportunity to demonstrate that understanding in action." Julian glanced toward the entrance, where Diana was calmly explaining the wait time to the increasingly insistent group. One executive, his voice carrying across the restaurant, was becoming particularly aggressive. "Do you know who I am?" the man demanded loudly. "I'm the CFO of Meridian Capital. We spend thousands here every month." Morgan's eyes met Julian's, the challenge clear. The restaurant had fallen silent again, all eyes moving between the disruption at the entrance and Julian standing beside Morgan's table. In this moment of truth, Julian faced a choice that would reveal whether he had truly grasped the lesson of the evening. Would he revert to his old patterns, rushing to accommodate the wealthy executives at the expense of other guests, or would he embody the values Morgan had just articulated? With a deep breath, Julian straightened his posture and moved purposefully toward the entrance, aware that Morgan Freeman, and indeed the entire restaurant, was watching his next move carefully. Julian approached the entrance where Diana stood composed yet firm before the group of executives. The CFO of Meridian Capital, a broad-shouldered man with an expensive watch flashing on his wrist, loomed over her with the entitled air of someone unaccustomed to hearing the word no. "Perhaps you didn't hear me," the man was saying, his voice slightly slurred. "We bring clients here constantly. Surely you can find us a table." Diana maintained her professional demeanor. "Mr. Harrington, I understand completely and we value your patronage. However, we're fully booked this evening. I'd be happy to arrange priority seating for tomorrow night." "That's not acceptable," Harrington snapped. "We're here now." Julian paused, acutely aware of Morgan's gaze on his back. Just hours ago he would have scrambled to accommodate these men, probably displacing other guests with less impressive credentials. The old Julian would have seen this as an opportunity to impress important clients, exactly the behavior that had led him to mistreat Morgan Freeman. Taking a deep breath, Julian stepped forward. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Julian Mercer, one of the waitstaff here at the Sapphire." Harrington turned to him with impatience. "Finally, someone who might understand the situation. We need a table immediately." Julian nodded respectfully but stood his ground. "I understand completely, sir, and I want to assure you that the Sapphire values all our guests equally. As Ms. Reynolds has explained, we're fully committed this evening, with reservations made weeks in advance." Harrington's face darkened. "Do you understand who you're talking to? One word from me could impact your quarterly revenue significantly." Julian felt a flutter of anxiety, but remembered Morgan's words about dignity and respect. "Sir, at the Sapphire, we believe that every guest deserves the same consideration, whether they're dining with us for the first time or the 100th. I'd be happy to take your information and personally call you when we have availability." The executives exchanged glances, unused to such treatment. Harrington leaned in, lowering his voice threateningly. "I want to speak to the owner, immediately." Julian's eyes momentarily flicked toward Morgan's table, where the owner sat watching. The interaction with quiet intensity. A small knowing smile played at Morgan's lips. "Actually, sir," Julian replied, newfound confidence in his voice, "the owner is here tonight. However, he's currently having dinner and discussing business. I'm certain he would tell you exactly what Ms. Reynolds and I have already explained, that the Sapphire doesn't prioritize any guest over another, regardless of their position or spending habits." From his table, Morgan nodded almost imperceptibly, approval evident in his expression. Harrington scoffed. "I find that hard to believe. Any sensible business owner would understand the value of accommodating clients like us." Julian stood straighter, channeling the quiet dignity he had witnessed in Morgan throughout the evening. The owner of the Sapphire believes that true excellence means treating everyone with the same respect. That's the foundation of our establishment. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harrington's face. Around them, other guests watched the exchange with interest, many nodding in appreciation of Julian's stance. Perhaps, Julian continued, his tone softening, I could offer a compromise. Our bar area can accommodate your group for drinks, and we'd be delighted to serve you appetizers there while you wait. If a table becomes available earlier than expected, you'll be the first to know. The tension in Harrington's posture eased slightly at this reasonable offer. One of his colleagues placed a hand on his arm. Come on, Richard, that sounds fair. We can have a few drinks and figure out another plan if needed. After a moment's hesitation, Harrington nodded curtly. Fine, but I expect exceptional service given the inconvenience. Every guest at the Sapphire receives exceptional service. Sir, Julian replied evenly, it's our standard, not our exception. As Diana led the group to the bar area, Julian returned to Morgan's table, his heart pounding but his resolve strengthened. He had passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. Well handled, Morgan observed, his distinctive voice carrying quiet authority. You stood your ground without being disrespectful. Julian inclined his head slightly. I was trying to apply what I've learned tonight. And what exactly have you learned, Julian? Morgan asked, setting down his fork and giving Julian his full attention. Julian considered the question carefully. That dignity isn't determined by appearance or status. That respect should be universal, not conditional. He paused, then added, with painful honesty, and that I've been fundamentally misunderstanding what makes a place like the Sapphire special. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. Those are valuable realizations, but I'm curious, why did you develop such a different philosophy? In the first place? It was a probing question, one that forced Julian to examine his own motivations. He swallowed hard, uncomfortable with the self-reflection, but recognizing its necessity. I grew up without much, Julian admitted, surprising himself with his candor. When I entered this industry, I saw how people with money were treated, how they moved through the world with ease and confidence. I wanted to be part of that world, to be accepted by it. He looked down. I thought that by keeping the right, people happy and filtering out the rest, I was proving my own value. James Parker, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. So you became the gatekeeper you once resented. Julian blinked, startled by the accuracy of the assessment. Yes, I never thought of it that way, but yes. Morgan took a sip of water, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. You know, I found that people who guard status most fiercely are often those who once felt excluded from it. The need to belong can transform into the need to exclude. The insight struck Julian with the force of revelation. He had spent years building his identity around associations with wealth and status, around being in rather than out. And in doing so, he had become exactly the type of person who would have rejected his younger self. That's painfully accurate, Mr. Freeman. Morgan smiled gently. Recognition is the beginning of growth, Julian. The question now is where you go from here. From the bar area came the sound of laughter. The Meridian executives, initially disgruntled, were now enjoying their drinks, their earlier entitlement softened by the dignified handling of the situation. Oh, you see, Morgan observed, following Julian's gaze, when you set clear boundaries respectfully, people generally rise to meet your expectations. Mr. Harrington over there expected preferential treatment because restaurants like ours have trained him to expect it. By treating him exactly as we treat everyone else, we've given him the opportunity to be his better self. Julian nodded, absorbing the lesson. The true measure of a fine establishment isn't how it treats its most prestigious guests, Morgan continued, but how it treats those who have no prestige to leverage. That's the standard by which I judge the Sapphire's success. The restaurant had settled back into its rhythm, the earlier tensions giving way to a more thoughtful atmosphere. At nearby tables, guests dined with greater awareness, some casting appreciative glances toward Morgan's corner. Mr. Freeman, Julian said finally, gathering his courage, I want to apologize properly for how I treated you earlier. It was inexcusable. regardless of who you are. Morgan considered him for a long moment. Julian, do you understand why your behavior was problematic? Because you're the owner, Julian ventured hesitantly. Morgan shook his head. No, because every human being deserves to be treated with dignity. Had I been exactly who you thought, I was just an ordinary man in an old coat, your behavior would have been equally wrong. The simplicity of this truth washed over Julian. The lesson wasn't about the consequences of mistreating someone important. It was about the fundamental error of judging anyone's worth by their appearance. I understand now, Julian said quietly. Morgan nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. Good. That's where real change begins. The evening at the Sapphire continued its progression with a newfound energy circulating through the elegant space. Julian moved between tables with a transformed demeanor, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine attentiveness. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable. Where before he had evaluated guests based on appearance and perceived status, he now approached each table with equal consideration. Morgan observed this transformation while enjoying the remainder of his meal. His eyes, keen from decades of studying human behavior for his acting roles, missed nothing. Beside him, James Parker reviewed expansion plans on his tablet, occasionally sharing details with Morgan in hushed tones. The Chicago location is nearly ready, James noted. We should be able to open by the end of the quarter. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. And the staff training? Have we implemented the same philosophy we established here? Absolutely. Diana has personally overseen the hiring process. Every candidate is evaluated primarily on their commitment to equal service. Their conversation painted a clearer picture of the Sapphire's true nature, not merely a successful restaurant, but the flagship of a carefully crafted vision spreading to other cities. This was no vanity project for Morgan Freeman. It was a purposeful enterprise built on deeply held values. Julian approached their table, his composure regained, though humility remained evident in his bearing. May I clear your plates, gentlemen? Thank you, Julian, Morgan replied warmly. The ribeye was excellent. Please convey my appreciation to Chef Marcus. Of course, Mr. Freeman. Julian collected the plates with practiced efficiency. Would you care for dessert this evening? James glanced at Morgan with a slight smile. Should we have Marcus prepare your favorite? Not on the menu, Morgan explained to Julian. Marcus makes a bread pudding with bourbon sauce that reminds me of something my grandmother used to make. Julian absorbed this new information, another personal connection between Morgan and the Sapphire that he had failed to recognize. I'll speak with Chef Marcus immediately. As Julian retreated toward the kitchen, Diana approached the table. Mr. Freeman, several guests have asked if they might greet you before they leave. The Bennetts and Ms. Chen in particular. Morgan smiled. Of course, please let them know they're welcome to stop by. Morgan's willingness to engage with other patrons further contradicted Julian's earlier assumption about the owner's aloofness. The man Julian had described to Morgan hours earlier, a distant investor who rarely visited, couldn't have been further from the reality now unfolding before him. In the kitchen, Julian approached Chef Marcus with newfound respect. Mr. Freeman would like the special bread pudding, Chef. Marcus nodded, already reaching for ingredients. His grandmother's recipe, he explained, measuring bourbon into a saucepan. He shared it with me during our first menu development session. Said proper hospitality always includes something that feels like home. Julian watched as Marcus prepared the dessert with personal care, adding another layer to Julian's understanding of Morgan's involvement with the Sapphire. This wasn't just an investment, it was a passion project infused with personal history and values. Chef, Julian ventured, how often does Mr. Freeman visit? Marcus considered the question while stirring the sauce. Depends. Sometimes weekly. He'll sit at the chef's table, taste new dishes, suggest adjustments. Other times he brings friends or family and enjoys the restaurant as any guest would. He glanced at Julian. Though I imagine they receive better service than he did tonight. Julian accepted the rebuke with a nod. I've made a terrible mistake. We all misjudge situations sometimes, Marcus replied, his tone softening slightly. The question is whether we learn from those mistakes. When Julian returned to the dining room, He found Judge Bennett and his wife chatting warmly with Morgan, while Lisa Chen had pulled up a chair beside James. The conversation flowed naturally, suggesting long-standing relationships rather than the celebrity fan interactions Julian might have expected. "Morgan was just telling us about the new location," Mrs. Bennett was saying. "We have family in Chicago who will be delighted. We're hoping to capture the same feeling," Morgan replied. "The architecture is different, of course, but the philosophy remains identical." Julian approached with the dessert, setting it before Morgan with careful precision. The bread pudding steamed gently, the bourbon sauce creating an enticing aroma. "Ah, perfect timing," Morgan said, glancing up at Julian. "Have you ever tried this, Julian?" Julian shook his head. "No, sir. I didn't know it existed until tonight." "Marcus perfected it over several months," Morgan explained, taking a bite with evident satisfaction. "We spent hours in the kitchen adjusting the recipe until it captured the essence of my grandmother's version, while still feeling contemporary." The personal story, shared so casually, highlighted again how deeply Morgan was invested in every aspect of the sapphire, from its philosophical foundation to its menu details. The disconnect between this reality and Julian's earlier characterization of an absent owner grew more striking by the minute. As the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, more staff members gathered near Morgan's table, drawn by the rare opportunity to interact with the owner in this unique context. Diana coordinated their approach, ensuring the restaurant's operation continued smoothly while allowing brief conversations. Julian noticed how Morgan greeted each employee by name, inquiring about family members and personal milestones with genuine interest. These weren't superficial exchanges, but demonstrations of a leader who valued his people as individuals. "Maria, how is your daughter enjoying NYU?" Morgan asked a longtime server. "She loves it, Mr. Freeman. That scholarship program you recommended made all the difference." Another layer of understanding clicked into place for Julian. Morgan Freeman wasn't just the restaurant's owner. He was a mentor and supporter to his staff, invested in their lives beyond the Sapphire's walls. As the restaurant began to empty, Julian found himself standing near Morgan's table once more, the weight of his misjudgment growing heavier with each new revelation. "Julian," Morgan said suddenly, "I'm curious about something." "Yes, Mr. Freeman. You've worked in fine dining for some time, I imagine?" Julian nodded. 10 years, sir, in Los Angeles and briefly in London before coming to New York." "And in your experience," Morgan continued, his tone conversational, yet probing, "what makes a restaurant truly exceptional? Not just successful, but meaningful?" Julian considered the question carefully, aware that his answer revealed more than just his professional philosophy. It illuminated his values. "Until recently," he admitted, "I would have said exclusivity, creating an environment where select guests feel special." He paused, reflecting on the evening's lessons. "But I'm beginning to understand there's something more powerful in creating a place where everyone feels valued." Morgan nodded approvingly. "Well said. Now let me ask you something else, Julian. Who do you think owns the Sapphire?" The question hung in the air, its apparent simplicity belied by the weight Morgan's tone placed upon it. Despite everything Julian had witnessed throughout the evening, the deference from staff, the familiarity with regulars, the personal connection to menu items, Morgan was offering him one final opportunity to articulate his understanding. Julian looked directly into Morgan Freeman's eyes, recognizing this moment for what it was, the culmination of the evening's education, the final exam after a night of intensive learning. "Based on what I believed when my shift began," Julian said carefully, "I would have described an absent investor, someone who viewed the Sapphire as merely a business asset." He swallowed hard, then continued, "But the truth I've witnessed tonight is entirely different." Morgan's expression remained neutral, waiting for Julian to complete his answer. Diana, Chef Marcus, the Bennetts, Lisa Chen, and the remaining staff all watched this exchange in silence, understanding its significance. The revelation that had been approaching all evening was finally about to arrive in full clarity. Julian took a deep breath, prepared to articulate what should have been obvious from the moment Morgan Freeman walked through the Sapphire's doors. Julian stood before Morgan Freeman, acutely aware of the attention focused on their exchange. The restaurant had quieted, the few remaining patrons and staff sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the background music seemed to have dimmed in anticipation. "The truth is," Julian continued, his voice steady despite his internal tumult, "the Sapphire isn't owned by some distant investor who views it as just another asset in a portfolio. It's owned by someone who cares deeply about every aspect of the experience, from the food to the atmosphere to how each guest is treated." Morgan's expression remained neutral, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. "The Sapphire is owned by someone who knows every staff member by name, who helped develop the menu personally, who has a favorite table but chose to sit in the worst spot tonight to understand the true character of his establishment." Julian took a deep breath. "The Sapphire is owned by you, Mr. Freeman, and not just legally or financially. You own its heart and soul." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the gathered staff. Morgan's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, but he wasn't finished with Julian yet. "And what does that mean to you now, Julian?" Morgan asked, his resonant voice carrying throughout the quiet space. "How does knowing who I am change your understanding of this place?" Julian recognized the deeper question beneath the surface. This wasn't about Morgan's identity. It was about the philosophy Julian had so fundamentally misunderstood. "It means I've been representing the Sapphire all wrong," Julian admitted. "I've been imposing my own values, exclusivity, status, judgment, on an establishment built on entirely different principles." He glanced around at the staff and remaining patrons. "I've been undermining everything you created here, not just tonight with you, but with every guest I've treated differently based on appearance or perceived status." Morgan nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in his expression. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Julian." Julian hesitated, then took the seat, aware of the symbolic shift from server to conversation partner. "When I was a young actor," Morgan began, his voice taking on the storytelling quality that had narrated countless documentaries, "I walked into a high-end restaurant in Los Angeles. I had just landed a small role, nothing significant but enough to celebrate with a nice dinner." He smiled at the memory. "I wore my best clothes, which weren't very impressive at the time. The maitre d' took one look at me and seated me by the kitchen doors." Julian winced, recognizing his own behavior in the story. "Throughout that meal," Morgan continued, "I was treated as an afterthought. The waiter brought my water with reluctance, took my order with impatience, and generally made it clear that in his assessment I didn't belong there. The parallel to tonight's events hung in the air, unmistakable. I remember thinking, if I ever succeed in this business, if I ever have the means, I'll create a place where no one feels that way." Morgan gestured around the Sapphire. "Years later, when this opportunity arose, that memory guided every decision." James Parker leaned forward. "When Morgan approached me about investing in the Sapphire, his first concern wasn't profit margins or celebrity appeal. It was creating a culture of universal respect." Chef Marcus nodded in agreement. "During our first meeting, Mr. Freeman spent more time discussing how we would make every guest feel valued than he did talking about the menu," Diana added softly. "The very first training session for staff emphasized one principle above all others. At the Sapphire, we judge success not by who dines here, but by how they feel when they leave." Julian absorbed these testimonials, each one deepening his understanding of how profoundly he had misrepresented the restaurant's true ethos. "I built the Sapphire as an answer to that experience," Morgan explained. "A place where the quality of service reflects the dignity of each guest, not their appearance or status. And I've been undoing that work," Julian acknowledged quietly. "Not irreparably," Morgan replied, his tone softening slightly. "The beauty of principles is that they can be reaffirmed at any moment. The question is whether you're willing to align yourself with the Sapphire's true purpose moving forward." Julian felt the weight of this question. It wasn't merely about keeping his job, but about a fundamental shift in his approach to his profession and perhaps his life. "I am," he said with quiet conviction. "Tonight has changed everything for me. I see now how hollow my previous approach was, how it diminished both the guests and myself." Morgan studied Julian's face, seeming to search for something beyond his words. After a moment he nodded, apparently satisfied with what he found. "We all make mistakes, Julian. The measure of character isn't avoiding them, but how we respond once they're recognized." Around them, the staff watched with varying expressions, some skeptical, others hopeful. Julian had spent weeks establishing his reputation among them. Rebuilding trust would take time and consistent demonstration of change. "Mr. Freeman," Julian said, gathering his courage, "may I ask why you didn't simply identify yourself when I first seated you? Why endure an entire evening of poor service?" Morgan exchanged a glance with James before responding. "Would you have learned the same lesson if I had?" The question gave Julian pause. Had Morgan revealed his identity immediately, Julian would have switched to obsequious service, but his fundamental perspective wouldn't have changed. He would have treated Morgan well because of who he was, not because every guest deserved such treatment. "No," Julian admitted. "I would have changed my behavior without changing my understanding." Morgan nodded. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come through difficulty. By experiencing the sapphire as someone you judged as unimportant, I could see whether our principles were being upheld or merely paid lip service." A realization dawned on Julian. "You've done this before, haven't you? Visited anonymously to evaluate the experience." "Occasionally," Morgan acknowledged with a slight smile, "though rarely to this extreme. Usually, I'm recognized fairly quickly." Diana added, "It helps us maintain our standards. Knowing that Mr. Freeman might experience the sapphire as any guest would keep us mindful of treating everyone with equal respect." Julian absorbed this additional dimension of Morgan's ownership. Not just financial investment or creative input, but ongoing stewardship, ensuring the restaurant remained true to its founding vision. Chef Marcus approached the table, wiping his hands on a towel. "Kitchen's closed, Mr. Freeman. Staff meal is ready in the back when you're finished here." Morgan nodded his thanks. "We'll join you shortly, Marcus." This casual mention of sharing a meal with staff further illustrated the community Morgan had built around the sapphire, a family rather than a mere business hierarchy. "Julian," Morgan said, his expression serious once more, "tonight revealed a gap between the sapphire's principles and its practice, at least in your approach to service. That gap needs to be addressed." Julian nodded, bracing himself for the inevitable conclusion, termination of his employment. "I believe in second chances," Morgan continued, surprising Julian, "but I also believe in accountability. Whether you continue with us will depend on your willingness to relearn what service truly means at the Sapphire." The offer hung in the air, not forgiveness without consequence, but an opportunity to grow and redeem himself. "I would be grateful for that chance, Mr. Freeman," Julian replied, sincerity evident in his voice. Morgan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. We'll begin tomorrow." He gestured toward the kitchen. "For now, join us for staff meal. It's a tradition here. At the end of service, we break bread together as equals." As Julian rose to follow Morgan and James toward the kitchen, he realized that the true revelation of the evening wasn't simply learning that Morgan Freeman owned the sapphire. It was understanding that ownership, in Morgan's view, wasn't about control or status. It was about responsibility to uphold values that transcended the restaurant itself. The moment of truth had arrived, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a profound shift in understanding that would continue to unfold long after this evening ended. The Sapphire's kitchen had transformed from a bustling workspace to an intimate gathering place. The stainless steel prep table in the center now held platters of food family style, Chef Marcus's special staff meal that concluded each evening. The hierarchy that governed service hours dissolved as everyone, from dishwashers to owners, took seats around the table. Julian hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of his outsider status in this nightly ritual. Morgan Freeman noticed his hesitation and gestured to an empty chair. "Join us, Julian. Everyone deserves a place at the table." The symbolism wasn't lost on Julian as he took the offered seat. Around him, staff members filled plates and passed bread, their conversation flowing easily despite the evening's drama. They had witnessed his humbling, yet here he was, invited into their circle. "First staff meal?" asked Maria, the server who had earlier mentioned her daughter at NYU. Julian nodded. I usually leave right after my shift. You've missed the best part of working here, she replied, passing him a basket of still warm bread. This is where we become more than co-workers. Morgan sat across from Julian, his presence commanding yet comfortable. He broke bread and passed portions around with the natural ease of someone who had done this countless times. There was no performative humility in his actions, just the authentic behavior of a man who genuinely saw himself as part of a community rather than above it. As the meal progressed, Julian observed the interactions around him with new eyes. Diana discussed weekend plans with a busboy. Chef Marcus listened intently to a dishwasher's suggestion about a preparation technique. James Parker helped clear empty plates without being asked. This wasn't mere collegiality. It was the practical application of the philosophy Morgan had described. Dignity extended to everyone, regardless of position. When the meal concluded, Morgan gestured for Julian to join him in the small office adjacent to the kitchen. James Parker excused himself, leaving Morgan and Julian alone for the first time that evening. "Sit down, Julian," Morgan said, settling into a simple chair rather than behind the desk. "I think it's time we talked properly." Julian took the seat. Opposite, hands clasped to hide their slight trembling. "Mr. Freeman, I want to apologize again for—" Morgan raised a hand gently. "I've accepted your apology. Now I'm more interested in understanding you." The statement caught Julian off guard. He had expected a formal reprimand, perhaps conditions for his continued employment, but not this invitation to reveal himself. "Tell me about your journey to the Sapphire," Morgan continued. "The real story, not the polished version from your resume." Julian hesitated, then decided that after tonight's lessons, honesty was the only reasonable path forward. "I grew up in Oakland," he began. "Single mother, 4 kids, never enough of anything. We lived in a neighborhood where fine dining meant the local diner served cloth napkins on Sundays." He smiled ruefully at the memory. "When I was 14, I got a job washing dishes at a restaurant downtown. It wasn't high-end, but it was nicer than anything I'd experienced before. I remember watching how the regular customers were treated, with deference, with care. I wanted that. Not just the service, but the ease they seemed to move through life with." Morgan nodded, listening with full attention. "I worked my way up, busboy, food runner, server. Each step I studied how wealth operated, how it commanded respect without asking. I learned to identify the markers, the watches, the shoes, the subtle signals." Julian paused, uncomfortable with his own confession. "Somewhere along the way, I started believing that the respect these people received was because of their worth, not their wealth." "And so you aligned yourself with them," Morgan observed, "guarding the gates of exclusivity you once couldn't enter." Julian nodded, the insight striking him anew. "I thought I was proving my own value by keeping others out." "I understand more than you might think," Morgan replied, surprising Julian. "I wasn't born into privilege either. Success came through, hard work and some good fortune, but I never forgot what it felt like to be judged for what I lacked, rather than valued for who I was." Julian considered this perspective. Morgan Freeman had reached heights of success Julian could barely imagine, yet had chosen to create an environment that deliberately countered the exclusivity Julian had spent his career enforcing. "The difference between us," Morgan continued gently, "isn't our beginnings but the lessons we took from them. You experienced judgment and decided to become the judge. I experienced it and decided to create spaces where judgment was suspended." The simplicity and truth of this observation struck Julian deeply. He had been so focused on escaping his past that he had unconsciously perpetuated its worst aspects. "Where do we go from here?" Julian asked quietly. "That depends on you," Morgan replied. "The Sapphire has clear principles. I need to know if you can genuinely align yourself with them, not just in behavior but in belief." Julian considered the question seriously. Could he dismantle years of cultivated prejudice? Could he find satisfaction in service that wasn't tied to status? "I want to try," he said finally. "Tonight changed something fundamental for me. I saw myself through others' eyes and didn't like what I saw." Morgan nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Recognition is the first step. Now comes the harder part, consistent action that reflects that new understanding. What would that look like? Julian asked. For the next month, you'll work alongside Diana, relearning the Sapphire's approach to service. You'll rotate through positions, host, busser, server, experiencing each role with new perspective. Morgan leaned forward slightly. And one day, each week you'll join me in visiting our community partners. Community partners? The Sapphire provides culinary training for youth from underserved neighborhoods, kids not unlike you were once. We host monthly dinners for families transitioning from homelessness. We work with senior centers to deliver meals prepared with the same care as our finest dishes. Morgan's eyes held Julian's steadily. The Sapphire isn't just about serving those who can afford fine dining. It's about extending that same dignity to those who can't. Julian absorbed these revelations, yet another dimension of the Sapphire he had completely missed. The restaurant wasn't merely practicing equal treatment within its walls, it was actively extending its philosophy into the broader community. I'd like that, Julian said, surprising himself with his sincerity. Morgan smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. Good. We begin tomorrow. He rose, signaling the end of their conversation. One last thing, Julian. The most powerful transformation isn't changing what you do. It's changing how you see. Once you truly see the equal worth in every person you encounter, the appropriate action follows naturally. As Julian left the Sapphire that night, the city streets looked somehow different. The late-night hot dog vendor, the taxi driver, the businessman hailing a ride. Julian viewed them all with new awareness, conscious of the stories behind each face, the dignity inherent in each life. 3 months later, the Sapphire hummed with its usual elegant energy. Julian moved through the dining room with confident grace, greeting a young couple celebrating their anniversary with the same warm attention he showed to the renowned surgeon at the window table. At the entrance, an elderly man in a worn suit hesitated, clearly uncertain about entering such an upscale establishment. Julian noticed immediately and approached with a genuine smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Sapphire. May I show you to a table?" The man's relief was visible. "I'm meeting my daughter. It's my birthday and she insisted, though I told her it was too fancy for an old man like me." Julian smiled warmly. "Everyone belongs at the Sapphire, sir. Let's find you the perfect table to celebrate your special day." From across the room, Morgan Freeman observed the interaction, nodding in quiet approval. The transformation was complete, not just in Julian's behavior but in his perception. And in this small moment between server and guest, the Sapphire's true purpose was fulfilled once again. As Morgan often reminded his staff, in a world that constantly evaluates worth based on wealth, appearance and status, the most revolutionary act is to treat every person with unwavering dignity. For in doing so, we don't merely serve meals. We nourish the human spirit and affirm the value that resides in each of us, regardless of the coat we wear or the table where we sit.